Hello and welcome to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and this evening I will be doing a review of this masterpiece, The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Now, this was another one of my rereads this year because I had adored this when I first read it at the age of 16, more or less. This was a very, very important novel in my life, and I wanted to, for one thing, make sure I still enjoyed it as much, and for another, I had become aware of the sad and tragic fact that the author was, well, a monster. I'll touch upon that a little bit at the end of my review. Was a monster, but see, I'm a big believer in death of the author, and I have a particular relationship to the concept of art and the artist. I'll get to that. So I wanted to see if that would affect my rereading of the novel, to see if, I perceived things that were unseemly, a reflection of her perversions and her crimes. My personal answer is no. I didn't find anything that bothered me that hadn't bothered me when I was 16. Me rereading this was in no way, shape or form influenced or tainted, more specifically, by my new awareness of Marion Zimmer Bradley's true character. So with that out of the way, if you're not familiar with the premise of this novel, this big, fat, chunky novel of little over 1,000 pages, this is basically a subtly feminist, at least female-centric, female-centered retelling of the Arthurian mythos. All of it. I mean, because there are lots of different versions of the story and the legend, which is rooted in Celtic mythology. You've had, Chrétien de Troyes had his versions, you had Sir Thomas Malory, and then lots of authors have obviously had their shot at the story and retelling it. But, I mean, it contains all the conceivable elements of the Arthurian story. You've got, of course, Camelot, the Round Table, the Quest for the Holy Grail, but then, I mean, all the characters, all of them. I mean, she creates characters in the story to fit all the names you can find in different versions. It's quite comprehensive and it's a sprawling story. I love that about it. And it's told from the point of view of a character who, in most other versions, is pretty negative, if not outright evil, or demonized, depending on how you choose to look at it. The narrator of the story is, well, her name in this novel is Morgane, but she is Morgan Le Fay, the famous witch who seduced Arthur, begat a child by him who would end up, well, killing him, Mordred. So the story is told from her point of view, and she's basically walking you through her life as a priestess and then the last high priestess of Avalon, and of the old Celtic pagan religion of Great Britain. An adept, a worshipper, priestess of the great goddess, which is the female aspect of the divine, and she had different names in Celtic cultures, and the male aspect of her had different names as well. So yeah, she tells you her life story, and this encompasses all these elements from the Arthurian mythos. It was beautifully written. Just beautifully written. There's something there's something mystical about it. There's something that's both ethereal about it, but at the same time deeply rooted in the rich, dark earth. The characters are complex, are nuanced, are just deeply flawed and deeply human. The dynamics between them, again, are complex, are varied. There's a bit of everything. And the story itself is massive. I mean, it spreads out over 40, 50 years. I mean, this is a saga, if nothing else. You really feel like you're there in ancient Britain after the Romans had left the Isles and Christianity was starting to settle in. I felt transported back through the mists of time, and I could feel the mists of magic and of mysticism and of being there at the pagan rites and being there when they have confrontations with the church and Christianity. It's just a full, rich experience, I can tell you. It's just amazing. It was just as amazing the second time around as it was the first. But beyond a female-centric retelling of the Arthurian legend, what is this? Well, it's a blend of, I would say, light historical fiction, fantasy fiction, though again, light fantasy fiction / magical realism. This is branded as fantasy, but there are a few historical elements to it as well. Now, I can't speak to what kind of research the author might or might not have done on the subject of not pre-Christian but peri-Christian Britain, so the Dark Age period between the departure of the Romans from the British Isles and the invasion by the Angles and the Saxons, because it's not set in a typically medieval framework like it is with, I think, La Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory or the works of Chrétien de Troyes, which themselves dated from the Middle Ages. So it's not medieval, it's Dark Age, post-antiquity, before the Middle Ages and feudalism, which was a real historical epoch. So yeah, there's definitely an element of historical fiction to it, with some degree of accuracy, I would say, overall. This is more prevalent in the other books in the Avalon series, like The Forest House or Priestess of Avalon or even Lady of Avalon, I think. The fantasy element, the magical realism element is definitely the strongest, I think, in this particular novel, but it's still that historical element that I think adds a lot of flavour and quality to the story. And then beyond the mythical elements of it, the legendary canon to which it ultimately belongs, it's a memoir, a fictional memoir of Morgaine's life, set within the context of these massive societal changes with the dying out of paganism and the rise of Christianity, and then the arrival of the Angles and the Saxons, ushering in the Middle Ages. But it's the story of her life. So in that sense, it's also very human, very real, very emotional, deeply felt. So that's really neat, I think. It's something that really makes this book stand out. And there are a crap ton of characters in this. Like I said, this is about the Arthurian legend, but about all of it. All the characters you think you know from all the different versions of the legend, they're all in there. Like, for example, Vivienne and Nimue are sometimes versions of the same character in different retellings of the story. Here they're separate characters, so you have all the names you could think of when you think of the Arthurian legend and various works. In here, they're all their own separate, distinct characters. So I'm going to talk about the characters, but I'm going to try and be short-ish about it and only focus on what I perceive to be like the main characters, otherwise we're going to be here all night. So obviously, the main character and the narrator of the story is Morgaine. Morgaine is the daughter of Igraine, who comes from a long line of Avalonian priestesses. In fact, she is the sister of the Lady of the Lake, Vivienne, and Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall. That being said, he dies pretty early on in the story and grows up at the court of Uther Pendragon. Her little brother is Arthur Pendragon, of course, little boy whom she loves very much. She is almost like an adoptive mother to him because her mum is so besotted with her soulmate Uther that she doesn't really pay that much attention to Arthur. Uther Pendragon himself identifies as a Christian, though he is pretty friendly towards pagans, at least at the beginning of the story. But at his court, there is a resident priest. Quite the stereotypically misogynistic priest, very much in favour of keeping the faithful in ignorance, i.e. worship God, love Jesus, but don't ask too many questions, especially not if you're a woman. So Vivienne, Morgaine's aunt, knows that this is going on, and after a while she sees that Morgaine isn't really getting anywhere. Her inherent magical, priestly pagan talents aren't being developed, so she comes and gets her and brings her to Avalon so she can start her proper priestly training. Morgaine, like I said, is very gifted in these slightly magical arts. Like I said, this is fantasy light, in my opinion. The magic isn't, in your face. There are no throwing of fireballs, summoning of dragons, flying around, nothing like that. It's more things like scrying in mirrors, prophesying, shaping weather patterns subtly, imbuing magical artifacts with protection spells, etc. And Morgaine is very talented in these things. She has a very inquisitive mind, she's curious, she's eager to learn and to, well, embrace the path of a priestess. She is, after all, fated to replace Vivienne as High Priestess of Avalon, as the Lady of Avalon with a capital L. But she's also quite willful, rebellious at times. She questions her appointed path a lot. And there's something pretty crappy that happens to her that makes her question everything. Her dedication to the goddess and to Vivian, who acts as a representative of the goddess on Earth. Something which Morgane does herself at several points in the book, actually. So there's kind of a love-hate relationship going on between Morgane and Avalon. She leaves Avalon for very long periods of time, for several years at a time. At the same time, she has this sense of duty towards her pagan faith and tradition. She also has, you know, a taste for the power that being a priestess of Avalon does give her. So yes, it's a complex life path, and she gains a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom, and you do feel a lot of compassion for her. She's a fascinating, complex, rich character, and yeah, she's probably one of my favorite female characters of all time, if I'm being honest. Then you have Vivian, the Lady of the Lake of classical legend. Vivian is a harder character, I would say. She has a will of steel. As a woman, as a person, I would say she's characterized by a deep moral, spiritual conviction that the Avalonian way is the right way, or at least the better way compared to, well, the Christian way. She butts heads all along the story with the priests and even some of her fellow druids who are, I would say, a little more open to the Christian message, or at least the church's message. At the beginning of the book, and, well, I mean, for a good part of the book, she's the High Priestess of Avalon, and in a way, she's the last great High Priestess of Avalon. She has a very heavy load of responsibility upon her shoulders, and she takes it to heart. I mean, it's her life. It's her life path. It's her identity. It is who she is. She will fight tooth and nail to preserve the old ways, the old religion, and, well, the respect and dignity and consideration it affords women, for one thing, and also the way it fosters knowledge and open-mindedness towards, you know, things like the organic life, the body, etc. I said she's a hard woman. She's not evil, she's not bad, nothing simplistic like that. But for example, when she brings in Morgane to Avalon, at first she's very warm towards her because she does act like a maternal figure, like a spiritual, motherly figure towards her, because throughout the series there's a concept of reincarnation, and actually in previous books they were like biological mother and daughter or sisters, so there's a deep spiritual connection between them. But after a while, you know, she's like, I'm the High Priestess. I'm at the top of our religious hierarchy. You're a novice. You owe me respect, obedience, subordination. But to be fair, in that respect, she's treating her like any other priestess, so she's actually being fair. But like I said, Morgane gets a pretty raw deal with a certain ritual ceremony. So that was pretty shitty, so she butts heads with Vivian a lot. And Vivian is just inflexible on some things. She's persuaded that what she's doing is fundamentally right. This is what I have to do to preserve Avalon and her traditions. So she's almost cruel towards Morgane in some cases. She's not always easy to love or to understand, but I did feel some compassion for her. I almost felt sad for her because she just won't accept that her way is going out. Her way is dying, the world is changing, but she will not accept this. She will not capitulate. She will not go gently into that good night. So there's something a bit tragic about her, but, you know, also a very interesting, complex character. Then you have Guinevere, the famed Lady of Camelot. To put it bluntly, I did not like Guinevere. I found her to be incredibly annoying at times, though I will try to be objective and acknowledge that there are mitigating circumstances. Guinevere, at her most essential, is a very vulnerable, fragile, and perhaps oversensitive person. I think in a way she's almost mentally ill. I choose to call it agoraphobia, whatever the accuracy of that may be. She's terrified of leaving her home. She's terrified of going outside into the wider world, of being exposed under the open sky. She was raised most of her life in a convent. That's where she got her education, if you can call it that. She's the only daughter of her father's first marriage, her father being a local British king. He remarried a younger woman, and he's only interested in having a male heir. He has no use for unmarried daughters because he follows the Roman, Christian, patriarchal way all the way. So she's married off to Arthur, which is pretty shitty for her. I mean, like I said, she's terrified of everything. Poor thing. She's terrified of everything. She needs a big hug. But at the same time, she is so convinced of her bigoted beliefs, you also kind of want to slap her, figuratively. She definitely finds refuge in religion, but it's a strange and, dare I say, toxic refuge, because the version of religion she's presented and made to absorb, well, tells her that women are evil, are dirty, are tainted because Eve ate that stupid goddamn apple, right? So there's a lot of self-hatred and guilt and shame in this young woman. She hates her femaleness and all the failings she associates with that state. She's also sterile. She cannot give Arthur an heir, and she's obsessed about the reasons why. It's because she's not praying hard enough, it's because she's dirty, she has impure thoughts. The amount of internalized misogyny in this woman is really staggering. But she isn't that likable, in my opinion, because then she goes out of her way to trash the pagans. They're all disgusting, dirty, perverted heathens. She trashes Morgaine, although they do have a friendship at one point, almost a sisterly bond, but then that goes sour and she's back on her hating the pagans and exterminating bandwagon. So yeah, not an easy character to love. I mean, there's several moments where I was like, oh, just shut up, will you? Shut up about your Christianity or your Christian extremism. I'm sick and tired of you. Go away. So yeah, I didn't like her, but at the same time, I do feel a measure of pity for her and just this terror she constantly lives in. On to some male characters. You have, of course, how could I not mention him, Arthur Pendragon, the famed King Arthur of legend. King Arthur, I would say, is overall a pretty positive character. He has a deeply ingrained sense of duty. Remember that he was raised knowing that he would become the long-expected High King of all the Britons, the one who would unite all the tribes, all the clans, and in a way, take the best aspects of both the Romano-Christian tradition and the native pagan Celtic tradition and just provide a united front against the threat of Anglo-Saxon invasion and just bring about a great, beautiful kingdom where people would prosper. So he deeply cares about this. He deeply cares about being a good leader, a good ruler for his people. But there is also a more negative aspect to him. He is human after all. He is raised mostly Christian as a child. Then he is fostered, because that was the tradition among the ancient Celts. His mentor, however, is the Merlin of Britain, who, well, is pagan. And he is really taught and encouraged to consider both the pagan and the Christian traditions and to take the best elements of both in a way. But over time, he kind of questions the necessity to uphold the old native ways because more and more people are converting to Christianity. His wife is extremely Christian and really hates the pagans, so he wonders, you know, who is this really serving in a way? Do I really need to fight so hard to preserve the Avalonian way? He's facing multiple stresses, the mounting invasion of the Anglo-Saxons, the church fathers whispering in his ears, and you have the druids saying different things, and you have the Avalonian priestesses who are worried about losing their status and what that means for women in the land, and of course his wife who can't bear him an heir. And this is really stressing him out, so there's a point where he's like, oh, especially you bloody women, I'm sick and tired of your nonsense, let's just simplify everything and go the Christian way, because that's the way of the future. So that was a little disappointing. Though there was something very touching about his relationship with his sister, Morgaine, which is quite complex and I won't go into it. But in the end, when he's at the doors of death, she is actually the one to comfort him, to provide him with familial love and warmth and to incarnate the goddess, the feminine side of God, to him. I like that. Also a very interesting character. On to Lancelot, the famous knight of romantic legend, shall we say. Lancelot is boisterous, adventurous. He has a wandering spirit and is extremely loyal to his king, for whom he probably has more than strictly heterosexual friendship feelings, I would say. Though he also loves his lady Guinevere. I didn't really understand their relationship ultimately, because it does start out as pure infatuation, but over time it does develop into something a bit more spiritual, a bit more emotional. What I find interesting about Lancelot, though, is that you can also sense there's something very sensitive about him. He's a troubled soul, a questioning soul. He is Vivienne's son, but she doesn't really care much about him once she realizes that he has zero interest in becoming a druidic priest himself and wants to become one of the Round Table's famed knights. He questions religion a lot. In fact, at some point, he states outright, I don't even think there is a god. However, there is a spiritual yearning in him, and that's what leads him ultimately onto the Grail quest, which does find fruition, but I won't say more than that. And finally, Merlin, or should I say the Merlins of Britain. Yes, that was an interesting twist on the classical canon of the Arthurian legend. The Merlin in the Mists of Avalon isn't a person, it's a title. It's basically the High Druid of Great Britain. So you have two of them in the novel. You have first Taliesin, the famed bard of Welsh mythology. He is basically the incarnation of the classical stereotypical Merlin, the one you would immediately imagine in your head if I were to say the name Merlin. He's an old, wise man with a sense of humor, with a lot of compassion inside of him, a lot of kindness, perhaps a certain naivete as well. He has a deep friendship with the Christian priests who reside on the Isle of Glastonbury, I'll get back to that, and really believes there's a way to work with the Christians and to find a working compromise for both traditions. So he has a lot of optimism, but I think he really misses the point that that's not the way it's going to go, and what will be the reality for the women in his land and, well, the women in his religious tradition. Then you have the second Merlin of Britain, Kevin. Kevin is a horribly disfigured man. He has a humpback, a lame leg. I think something happened to him in a fire. He was crushed under wood or something. So this is something that really haunts him because it affects his relationships with others and women specifically. So I think there's a bit of latent misogyny inside of him. He's a wonderful harpist. That's really the core of his identity. Taliesin was the great bard, the great singer, but Kevin is the master harpist. He has this beautiful, custom-crafted harp that never leaves his side. I mean, he basically says, this is the love of my life. This is the object in which my soul resides. And he too is fairly open to the church's message. He takes mass with the priests. And yeah, doesn't really always defend his Avalonian sisters. I said latent misogyny. I don't think it's overt, because he has a very interesting, loving relationship with Morgane. I think he's actually in love with her. She loves him back, though perhaps not in quite the same way or to the same exact degree, but they do share an intimate connection, and he does care for her. He does care for the women in his order, but ultimately these issues he has with women, I think, taint his judgment of the situation with Christianity. But yeah, like I said, all of these characters are very complex. They have complex interactions with one another. It's just great stuff. Beyond being a deeply human and character-based story, as well as being a female-centered retelling of the Arthurian legend, I would say there are three main themes running throughout this novel. First, the one that most obviously jumps out at you is the theme of female-centric spirituality and or religion, which is presented to you through the Sisterhood of Avalon, and the feminine aspect or side of paganism. Paganism or nature-based religions themselves being a sub-theme attached to this. Now, in the Mists of Avalon, I would say that overall, the shape this takes is almost a little too modern, very akin to the Wiccan system, which is duotheistic. So you have the great goddess and the great god, or more specifically the horn god. But I do want to mention that in some of the other books in the Avalon series, especially ones that take place before the Mists of Avalon, such as the Forest House, where the Romans are still occupying Britain and the purely Celtic elements are more prominent, you do have mentions of actual, well, Celtic deities such as Tyrannus or Tutates, and, you know, the Great Raven, which I think is called Cathu Bodva in the books, but who is akin to, you know, the Morrigan and Irish mythology. And they are somewhat mentioned in the Mists of Avalon, but I would say it's a little more subdued in favour of, like, the Great Goddess or the Great Horn God. That being said, it's not a fluffy, wooey, new agey version of paganism either. The nitty-gritty elements, the earthy, raw, organic elements of old paganism are also present. I mean, you have blood-based rituals, you have a ritual hunt that then devolves into a sacred marriage, a hierogamous ceremony that involves taking mushrooms, I guess, and trance-like states and sex, things like that. So I did appreciate that. I think that's a bit more accurate than just the fluffy, sparkly aspects of some branches of neo-paganism that are very legitimate and serious branches of neo-paganism that are recognized religions. So I'm really not trying to mock those. But then more specifically, the importance of the divine feminine, the female side and aspect of God, the divine, whatever you choose to call it, is stressed throughout the novel, obviously because it's also the one that's most threatened by the rise of Christianity, because Christianity rejects the female side of the divine. This was very important to me on a personal level. I've mentioned before in another video, I'm not strictly speaking pagan, I'm a pantheist. So there are a lot of parallels between the shape my faith takes and some elements present in the novel or elements you can find in modern neo-pagan movements. So yeah, it was very important to me. I can understand that this particular theme might not appeal to atheists or agnostics or monotheists, but yeah, this celebration of female spirituality, of the inherent divinity, if you want to call it, of the female, of the generative powers of the mother, the destructive powers of the dark mother as well. These things were very meaningful to me, really to stress, emphasize the spiritual dignity, the spiritual equality of men and women as human beings, but also as gods and deities, if you will. But this obviously leads to the second main theme, which is a bit more contentious, perhaps. It's the theme of the conflict, the real historical conflict, actually, between, well, paganism, pagan religions, earth-based religions, and, in this specific instance, Christianity, though you could extend the reasoning somewhat to the other two monotheistic religions. I think some people perhaps have the idea that this book trashes wholesale Christianity and monotheism. From a superficial and cursory reading, I could understand why someone would think that. Reading more deeply into it, though, you can see that that's not exactly the case. I would say this book makes a case against, well, the bad aspects of the Christian faith or monotheistic faiths in general, which are factual. These things, these darker aspects, deserve to be trashed and called out. Which they are, which there have been throughout history, more in favor of atheism and agnosticism than other types of spiritual traditions, but nevertheless, that has happened. You know, it's not so much the teachings of Jesus the man, it's more the teachings of the church and the church fathers and the institution they created based upon their interpretation of the teachings of the figure of Jesus Christ. the misogynistic aspects, the warmongering aspects, the anti-nature aspects, the, I guess, xenophobic aspects, all the teachings that reject sex, the body, the material life and plane as dirty things, which is a bit ironic considering God created those. Didn't think God could create such disgusting things, but theological inconsistencies, am I right? In fact, what's interesting in this novel is that several times the Druids, and even the Avalonian priestesses such as Morgane or Vivian, recognize that there are a lot of good things about the Christian message, or again, more specifically, the message of Jesus. They don't consider him the Son of God, they don't accept that, they find that a ridiculous claim, but they do acknowledge him as a spiritual leader, a philosopher, an enlightened one, a wise one, and they respect his message of love, of compassion, of upholding the weak and the vulnerable, and of elevating humanity to better, higher standards. So they're actually all in favor of that. Like I said, some of the Druids actually cooperate with the priests. There's a suggestion that the early Christian settlers of Great Britain actually got along pretty well with the Druids, and perhaps to a lesser extent the priestesses because they're female, but still, they all sort of got along and respected each other's differing spiritual paths. So that's pretty nice. What they're trashing, what they're calling out, what they're afraid of is the church itself. The twisted interpretation of Jesus' teachings and the more classical, monotheistic Old Testament traditions that are really pretty bad, if you're familiar with them. So no, it's not anti-Christianity per se. Yes, paganism is presented as being slightly better, as being more open to variety in the divine, to sharing knowledge and actually elevating people out of ignorance and barbarism in a way. But like I said, you know, there are pretty crappy, questionable aspects of paganism presented as well. Historically accurate aspects, blood rituals, or there aren't any overt human sacrifices, but those happen under paganism. So paganism is not presented as being perfect or flawless in any way at all, either. It's pretty balanced overall. But one thing that the pagans have going for them, yes, is this respect for life on Earth in this flesh and blood body, and for the female and the female aspect of creation, which the church just rejects wholesale. And a third and final theme goes to the profound sadness and melancholia which is present in this novel. The Mists of Avalon is fundamentally about the ending of an era, of an age, of a way of life, of a way of believing, of a way of thinking, in favor of a newer, perhaps darker one. Like I said, it doesn't actually trash the Christian message, or at least the Christic message. But yes, it does suggest that with the rise of the church and the threat of the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, Great Britain will be experiencing an age of darkness, the Middle Ages, right? And that the world is going to go through a very rough patch of ignorance, oppression, both political and spiritual, and that all the good things Avalon espouses will be forgotten and just suppressed until the time is right for humanity to embrace it again. So there's something very, just sad. You know that the pagan ways are dying. The ways of trying to elevate men and women are going away for a long while. It sounds all very doom and gloom, like there's no more hope to be had, because the world is ironically both no longer open to hearing the message of Avalon and not yet ready to listen to it. Another very interesting concept introduced in the Mists of Avalon is that the Isle of Avalon itself kind of exists in a dual physical state. It exists in like 2 dimensions. So you have the Avalon of the priestesses, of the Druids, and then you have the Glastonbury of the priests and nuns. To get to Avalon, you have to go through this magical ritual of parting the mists, and you will get there. If you don't manage to perform this ritual, you end up on the Isle of Glastonbury, where there's a monastery and a convent, and It's repeated throughout the novel that it's getting harder and harder to actually access Avalon. Even if you can perform magic ritual, it's just getting more difficult to actually access the island of the priestesses and druids. Because belief itself shapes reality. Our reality. What people choose to believe in can become real or disappear if people stop believing in it. It's kind of a bit like the old folklore concept that fairies cease to exist if you don't believe in them. This is a more elaborate development of that basic idea, but I think it's a very interesting idea that what we believe actually physically shapes reality. Food for thought there. So yeah. Avalon is literally disappearing into the mists of time, and by the end of the novel, when Morgaine is old and there are a handful of priestesses left on the island, no one goes there anymore. It's disappearing from the collective memory. However, there is a little kernel of hope. Morgaine one day stumbles upon the Isle of Glastonbury. A bit by accident, she goes through the mists without even realizing. As the priestesses of Avalon wear very dark robes, she's taken as one of the nuns. And Morgaine decides to go into a little chapel. In the chapel is a statue of the Virgin Mary, and she observes that the feet of the Virgin Mary are very well worn, very smooth, suggesting that a lot of supplicants have come to, put their brow to the toes of the statue, to ask for mercy, help, spiritual succor, to ask for the nurturing presence of the mother. And so she thinks to herself, well, it would seem the goddess hasn't been completely driven away by the church. She still exists, she is still present in the world, in a different form, in perhaps a lesser form, but she is still there for those who need her, for those who seek her. And one day, perhaps, she will come back in her full glory. And that warms her heart. And she goes back home to the island of Avalon, and the story basically ends. Let me tell you, the first time I read that, and the second time I read it back in May, I was bawling like a baby. It was so incredibly moving and such an emotional moment. The tears were streaming down my face. Such a powerful ending with just, the slightest little smidge of hope, this little kernel of light to guide humans throughout the years, to have us progress despite everything into hopefully an age of greater enlightenment. Whether that's ultimately spiritual or secular, I don't think that matters much. But I thought that was a beautiful way to end the novel. And now I will read some quotes from the book. I have no quarrel with the Christ, only with his priests, who call the great goddess a demon and deny that she ever held power in this world. At best, they say that her power was of Satan, or else they clothe her in the blue robe of the Lady of Nazareth, who indeed had power in her way too, and say that she was ever virgin. But what can a virgin know of the sorrows and travail of mankind? All the gods are one god, and all the goddesses are one goddess. The great goddess will not be angry if you call her by the name of Mary, who was good and loved mankind. For a part of the Druid wisdom lies in the saying that God, who is beyond all, cannot be worshipped in any dwelling made by human hands, but only under his own sky. And yet you build churches and deck them richly with gold and silver. Wherefore, then, is the evil in drinking from the sacred springs which God has made and blessed with vision and healing? She thought, as for a moment the three of them stood in a brief embrace, all women, indeed, are sisters under the goddess. I am not your confessor, Guinevere, and you, not I, are the one who professes belief in a god who will damn you because you share your bed with a man who is not your husband. My goddess is gentler with women. Flower and fruits and seed, and all things return and grow and come to light and at the last give up their bodies into the keeping of the lady again. But she who works, silently and alone, at the heart of nature, cannot work her magic without the strength of him who runs with the deer and with the summer's sun draws forth the richness of her womb. And it seemed to her for the moment that this love was the greatest truth in her life, and that love could never be weighed out or measured, so much for this one and so much for that, but was an endless and eternal flow, that the more she loved, the more love she had to give, as she gave it now to everyone, as it had been given her by her vision. Well, so it must be. For as man saw reality, so it became. While the ancient gods, the goddess, were seen as benevolent or life-giving, so indeed had nature been to them. And when the priests had taught men to think of all nature as evil, alien, hostile, and the all gods as demons, even so they would become, surging up from within that part of man which he now wished to sacrifice or control, instead of letting it lead him. The sin was not that we lay together, but that there was strife, and less of love therefore. I am the queen now. There is no goddess but this, and I am she. And yet beyond this she is, as she is in Igraine, and Viviane, and Morgause, and Nimue, and the queen. And they live in me too, and she, and within Avalon they live forever. Now, before I end this video, I would like to address the ongoing debate of whether or not you can divorce the art from the artist. Like I mentioned at the beginning of my review, The Mists of Avalon sadly was written by a very bad person. And I'm not just talking about someone who has questionable views, someone like H.P. Lovecraft, who was apparently a raging racist and xenophobe, but who never, to my knowledge, actually committed any kind of hate crimes. No. Marion Zimmer Bradley molested her daughter for several years, and was also apparently completely, fully aware that her husband molested/raped several boys over the course of, I don't know exactly how many years, but I'm assuming there were a few of them. So yes, she was a child molester/rapist. And this is the worst I've ever encountered in the area of authors whose books I've enjoyed. The first time I read The Mists of Avalon, and then when I read the other books in the series, I had no idea about this. I learned this much later, but I still enjoyed The Mists of Avalon. My reading experience was in no way, shape or form tainted by my knowledge that the author was a monster. Nothing in my library comes close to this. I mean, I've read something by H.P. Lovecraft, which I enjoyed, and which, in my opinion, wasn't tainted by his racist worldview. I've read some D.H. Lawrence, who, in my opinion, again, was a wee bit sexist, but no, nothing on the level of Marion Zimmer Bradley. This did not affect my rereading of The Mists of Avalon, because for one thing, I believe in the concept of death of the author, which simply means I am able to divorce the art from the artist. But beyond that simple catchphrase, I just think it really depends upon the work of art. You really need to evaluate this on a case-by-case basis, or work of art by work of art basis. You have to ask yourself, is the work itself endorsing disgusting things such as child sexual abuse, or eradicating large swaths of people, or being cruel to animals, things like that? In the case of The Mists of Avalon, I just don't see it. I do not think it's there, nor have I perceived this in the other Avalonian books, though I've only reread The Mists of Avalon. Apparently, this is a bit more prevalent in her science fiction series, the Darkover universe. I have never had any interest whatsoever to read those books, however, so ultimately I'll never know. See, this is a thing that perhaps some people who aren't artists, or at least creative types themselves, don't really understand or are aware of, is that the art and the artist don't always 100% reflect one another. I say this because I speak from experience. I wouldn't go so far as to call myself an artist with a capital A, but I do have artistic impulses. I'm a creative person. I draw. I play music. Now, I understand that drawing or playing music perhaps doesn't necessarily entail the same kind of intimacy as writing things down, but still, I think the parallels apply. When I draw something, it doesn't always reflect me 100%. Sometimes I will put myself fully into an illustration. It will really reflect my essence as a person. Sometimes I'm just goofing off with my pencils and markers, you know? Sometimes I'm doing a style exercise. Sometimes it's just, me doodling. It doesn't say anything about me as an individual. So the art can reflect the artist. The art can partially reflect the artist. Some things in a novel or a painting or a piece of music can reflect aspects of the creator, and not reflect others, or reflect things that have nothing to do with the creator. And even sometimes the work of art reflects nothing personal about its originator. It really is all a matter of context and analysing the work on its own merits, I believe. Something else which helps me separate the art from the artists and helps me to evaluate it perhaps a bit more independently is that I've never really much cared about the personality of the creator whose works I enjoy. See, I read a book, for example, because the story sounds interesting or the themes sound interesting. I don't usually look up the author before I read a book, or I listen to a piece of music, or I go to a museum and look at paintings. If I like the author, if I enjoy their personality, that to me is a bonus. So for example, I consider myself a fan of A Song of Ice and Fire. I'm not a fan of George R.R. Martin. I'm not saying George R.R. Martin is a criminal or a rapist by any means, not at all. I just don't really care about him as a person. I mean, I wish him good health and happiness, but don't really care about who he is. I mean, I'm a bit aware of some things because I follow YouTubers who analyze the series and things like that, but it's just an example. Like, I'm not a fan of Marion Zimmer Bradley. I never was to begin with. I'm just a fan of the Avalon series and the Mists of Avalon specifically. There are exceptions, however. I consider myself a fan of Ursula K. Le Guin, may she rest in peace, because I've loved every single thing, or at least I've greatly enjoyed the majority of what I have read by her, and I actually, from the little research I did, found that she was an interesting person. She's someone I would have loved to have a conversation with. When she died, I was actually genuinely upset by that. But that's an exception. Same goes for other media I enjoy, especially music. For example, I'm a big movie soundtrack fan. I love a lot of the works of John Williams, Hans Zimmer, Howard Shore, things like that. I know absolutely nothing about them as people, though. I just enjoy the music. If it speaks to me on a deeply personal, emotional level, that's good enough for me. But there again, there are exceptions. For example, I consider myself a fan of Florence and the Machine, and I actually like little I know of Florence Welch, the artist and woman. She seems like a very nice, positive person, and I'd love to have a conversation with her, right? But that's an exception. So I think both of these things, the fact that I can have an appreciation as a creative person myself of the creative process and how it can reflect, partially reflect, or not reflect at all the creator, and because I just in general don't really care at first at least about creators of works I enjoy, this has really allowed me over time to compartmentalize my analysis and enjoyment of books, music, drawings, comics, things like that. Now, I recognize that this isn't always possible for a lot of people. I'm not really sure how the statistics work there. And if you're someone who's highly sensitive to these things, I don't really know what to call it, but this conflict between art that is great and an artist who's a despicable human being, look, I can respect that. We're all different. We all have different sensibilities. So you do what you need to do to be comfortable and happy with the art you enjoy, the books you read. Like I always say, there's only so much time and there's so many books. You've got to be selective. And to be fair, you know, I would rather invest in authors that are at minimum decent people, right? This was just like, it's a fluke. I didn't choose this, and I really hope this doesn't happen with any other author whose works I've enjoyed. But I guess sometimes you can't control these things, right? So if you can't read it, I guess the only thing I would say is if you're worried about contributing financially to an author such as Marion Zimmer Bradley, I mean, in her case, she's long dead. Or in the case of a living author, I guess you could always buy secondhand or borrow the book from a library. Those are all perfectly respectable choices. I guess the only thing I'm asking is that while I can respect people who aren't capable of divorcing the art from the artist as neatly as I'm most generally able to do is that you respect this about me. Don't judge me for the books I love just because the author happened to be, in this case, a monster. I do not endorse pedophilia, I do not endorse child abuse by any means. I just don't see it in the Mists of Avalon. The Mists of Avalon remains to me a masterpiece, a magnificent, beautiful book that has moved me deeply, which has been extremely important in my life, in the shaping of my own spiritual path. And that's just the way it is. In a way, I'm kind of confused, if I'm perfectly honest, that Marion Zimmer Bradley, being who she was, could actually write something so beautiful. If I were a bit more superstitious or woo-woo-y, I would say she channeled a higher power, a higher consciousness. Now, I don't really believe in that, but you almost want to say that there was a crack in her individuality that allowed her to let through something greater than the evilness inside of her. I don't know. It's very strange. It is disturbing, but I guess that's just part of living in a grey, complex, screwed up human world, you know? It is what it is. Let's just all respect each other's differing sensibilities on this subject. It is a complex but very important subject to talk about, I think. And yeah, that's what I have to say about that for now. So after that more serious note, I think it's an important discussion to be had in the reading community. Also, I'll quickly add that, you know, even those of us who can read these works should not shy away from stating that the authors were bad people, or, you know, horrific people in this case. Like I've stated at the beginning of my review, I'm fully aware that the author was a monster. I'm not shying away from that. I'll state it whenever I talk about this book. I still enjoy this book, and I will still keep it in my library. It will remain one of my favorite books of all time, but yeah, I'm fully aware it was written, sadly and bafflingly, by a monster. In any case, that being said, did you read The Mists of Avalon? Did you like it? Did the fact that it was written by a horrible piece of shit human being deter you from rereading it? Has it colored your enjoyment of the book if you loved it? Are you incapable of even trying it because of that? I mean, please let me know what you think about this. It's an important topic. And in any case, I hope you will have a lovely day or evening, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye bye.